The day was overcast, with a gray sky blending seamlessly into the endless expanse of ocean. As the helicopter descended onto Rig 827, the rhythmic thrum of its blades was swallowed by the oppressive silence of the surrounding sea. From above, the oil rig appeared lifeless, its steel skeleton rising defiantly from the waves, shrouded in a mist that seemed to cling unnaturally close to its structure. For the 8-member crew arriving for their 6-month rotation, it was a disquieting sight, though none dared voice their unease. Rig A-27 had been operational for years, but its remote location made it a grueling assignment. Positioned far beyond the usual trade routes and supply lines, the rig was practically a self-contained world. It was tasked with extracting oil from the deepest layers of the ocean floor, a feat that pushed both technology and human endurance to their limits. The previous crew had completed their stint without incident, or so the company claimed, but the hurried nature of the shift change hinted at an underlying urgency. Captain Roger Wallace, a veteran of offshore drilling, was the first to step off the helicopter. His boots hit the deck with a resolute thud, and he surveyed the rig with the measured gaze of someone who had seen it all. Behind him came the rest of the team: engineers, technicians, and a medic, all seasoned professionals accustomed to the harsh isolation of offshore work. Yet, as they disembarked, an unspoken tension lingered in the air. It wasn't just the location, it was the rig itself. The platform was eerily quiet, its machinery dormant, and its corridors devoid of life. Normally, the outgoing crew would still be present, preparing for their departure. Yet here, there was no sign of them. A clipboard containing the rig's operational log lay abandoned near the control room door, as if someone had left in haste. The crew exchanged uneasy glances, but Captain Wallace dismissed their concerns with a gruff wave. "Probably just eager to get back to shore," he muttered. As they ventured further into the structure, the unease deepened. The quarters were immaculate, but devoid of personal effects, as though the previous team had vanished overnight. The mess hall was fully stocked, yet untouched, its coffee machine still half-filled with stale liquid. Sarah McAllister, the team's medic, noted the oddity aloud. "It's like they were planning to leave in a hurry, but never got the chance," she said, her voice cutting through the heavy silence. "Focus on the task," Wallace replied curtly. "We got work to do." But even he couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. By midday, the crew had begun powering up the rig systems, but complications arose almost immediately. The main control panel, a robust piece of equipment designed to withstand the harshest conditions, flickered erratically as if plagued by a power surge. Tyler Jenkins, the lead technician, frowned as he examined the readings. "These sensors are going haywire," he muttered, tapping the screen. "It's like something's interfering with the signal." "Could be the weather," offered Maria Lopez, the communications officer, though her tone lacked conviction. The mist outside had thickened, reducing visibility to mere meters. It clung to the rig like a living thing, curling around its beams and ladders. As the day wore on, the team settled into their routines, trying to ignore the mounting oddities. Sarah found herself drawn to the rig's medical bay, where she discovered a peculiar logbook tucked away in a drawer. Its pages were filled with cryptic notes and fragmented sentences, many of them referencing strange noises and recurring nightmares among the previous crew. One entry, scrawled in shaky handwriting, read, "The sounds are getting louder. It's coming from beneath us." That night, the crew gathered in the common room for their first meal on the rig. Conversation was sparse, each member preoccupied with their own thoughts. Outside, the ocean was eerily calm, its surface undisturbed except for the faint lapping of waves against the platform. As the hours dragged on, a faint sound reached their ears, a low, rhythmic thrum that seemed to emanate from the rig itself. "Probably just the drilling equipment warming up," Wallace said, though no one had activated the drills. The crew exchanged uneasy glances but said nothing. For now, the sound was just an anomaly, a footnote in what was shaping up to be an unusual assignment. None of them could have guessed that it was only the beginning. The oil rig, isolated and surrounded by an endless expanse of water, had already begun to reveal its secrets. Unseen eyes watched from the depths below, and in the silence, something ancient stirred. The first full day on Rig A27 began with a stillness that felt unnatural. The usual clamor of machinery, the hum of generators, and the occasional squawk of seabirds were absent, leaving only the faint whisper of waves. Maria Lopez, the communications officer, sat in the control room trying to establish a stable link to headquarters. She had been at it for hours, but the signal remained patchy. Every transmission was riddled with static, and when her voice did break through, she was met with silence from the other end. "I don't get it," she muttered, adjusting the frequencies again. "Satellite comms should be crystal clear out here." Tyler Jenkins, the lead technician, leaned over her shoulder, his brow furrowed. "The equipment's fine. I triple-checked it this morning. Could be interference from the mist." Maria didn't respond. The mist, still clinging stubbornly to the rig, had grown denser overnight. Through the windows, it loomed like a living wall, cutting off the rig from the rest of the world. It wasn't just fog. It had a strange, almost oily sheen, and the way it moved against the rig's structure suggested a purpose that no one wanted to acknowledge. Meanwhile, Sarah McAllister couldn't get the logbook out of her head. The fragmented entries gnawed at her thoughts, especially the one about the noises. She decided to bring it up during breakfast. As the crew gathered in the mess hall, she slid the journal onto the table and tapped the incriminating page. "Anyone else notice anything strange about this place? Besides the obvious, strange how?" Wallace asked, barely looking up from his coffee. "Listen to this." Sarah read aloud. "The sounds are getting louder. It's coming from beneath us." She glanced around the table, gauging their reactions. Most of the crew avoided her gaze, but Tyler scoffed. "Come on, Sarah. It's an oil rig. We're sitting on top of one of the loudest, most chaotic environments on the planet. The ocean floor's a noisy place." "I know that," Sarah shot back. "But this feels different." That evening, the different became undeniable. Around midnight, as most of the crew slept, a noise began to rise from the depths. It started faint, like a distant rumble, but soon became a rhythmic, pulsing sound, like the beat of a massive drum. Those awake stopped what they were doing, frozen by the unnatural cadence. Wallace was the first to investigate. Clad in his oil-streaked coveralls, he stepped out onto the rig's main deck with a flashlight. The beam cut through the mist, illuminating the steel grating beneath his boots and the towering crane above. But it couldn't penetrate the darkness below the rig. The sound was louder out here, reverberating through the platform like the heartbeat of something immense. One by one, the rest of the crew joined him, their faces pale with unease. "What is that?" Maria whispered, her voice trembling. "It's pressure, maybe," Tyler offered unconvincingly. "The new cavern we hit could be causing some kind of geological echo." Wallace wasn't buying it. "Pressure doesn't sound like this," he said, his voice low. "This is deliberate." Then came the voices, soft at first, like whispers carried by the wind, but unmistakable. The crew froze, straining their ears. The words were indecipherable, but their tone was haunting, pleading, mournful, and cold. They seemed to rise from the water itself, blending with the pulsing rhythm. "Is someone out there?" Sarah asked, stepping toward the edge of the deck. "Don't," Wallace barked, grabbing her arm. He shone his flashlight over the railing, revealing nothing but the swirling mist. The voices grew louder, and now it was clear. They were calling names. "Wallace! Sarah! Maria!" Each name echoed with eerie precision, spoken in tones that mimicked loved ones left behind on shore. "Back inside!" Wallace ordered, his voice cutting through the growing panic. The crew scrambled, slamming the heavy steel door behind them. Inside the control room, Wallace addressed the group, his face grim. "No one goes out alone. No one goes near the edge. I don't care what you hear." The crew nodded, too shaken to argue. But in the corners of the room, the whispers persisted, faint and insidious. They weren't coming from the ocean anymore. They were coming from within. The rig wasn't just isolated. It was alive, and it had begun to speak. Morning on Rig A27 was an illusion, with no rising sun to signal the day. The mist still hung thick, erasing any trace of horizon. Inside, the crew huddled over steaming mugs of coffee, their exhaustion evident. None of them had slept well. The whispers from the night before lingered in their minds, unsettling and invasive. The noise had faded shortly after they retreated indoors, but its echo seemed embedded in the rig itself. Sarah McAllister was the first to break the silence. "Whatever's out there," she said, stirring her coffee absently. "It knows we're here." Wallace bristled. "It's not something. It's the wind or a mechanical fault. We've dealt with worse than spooky noises before. Everyone needs to focus." His tone brooked no argument, but his eyes betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. Tyler Jenkins tried to latch onto the captain's pragmatism. "We should check the submersible sensors," he suggested. "If something's happening below, the seismic data might give us a clue." An hour later, Tyler and Maria Lopez descended into the belly of the rig, where the monitoring equipment sat in a cramped control bay. The room was filled with humming servers and flickering monitors displaying oceanographic readings. Tyler leaned over the primary console, inputting commands to pull up seismic and pressure data from the seabed. "Here we go," he said, gesturing to a graph that began populating on the screen. Maria stepped closer, her brow furrowing as she interpreted the data. "This can't be right," she murmured. The readings showed massive fluctuations in pressure and heat deep beneath the rig, far beyond what any geological activity could explain. The temperatures alone were alarming, suggesting something unnatural was taking place below the ocean floor. "Is it a gas pocket?" Tyler asked, though he knew the answer was unlikely. Maria shook her head. "No, gas pockets don't generate heat like this." She pointed to another section of the graph. "And look at this. It's almost rhythmic, like a pulse." Tyler's stomach dropped. He opened the audio feed from the underwater microphones installed near the drill. A low hum filled the room, faint but unmistakable. It was the same sound they'd heard the night before, only now it was constant, like a distant machine grinding away in the depths. "We should take this to Wallace," Maria said, her voice barely above a whisper. But Tyler hesitated, staring at the screen. "Wait, did you see that?" he asked, pointing to a live feed from one of the underwater cameras. The grainy footage showed the drill site, its massive steel arms extending into the sediment. For a moment, nothing seemed amiss, but then the shadows shifted. Something moved just beyond the edge of the frame. It was quick, a flicker of motion in the murky water, but unmistakable. "Rewind it," Maria urged, her pulse quickening. Tyler scrubbed the footage back a few seconds and played it again. The screen flickered, and there it was, a dark shape, massive and sinuous, disappearing into the gloom. "What the hell was that?" Maria breathed, her hand gripping the edge of the console. "I don't know," Tyler admitted, his voice unsteady. He saved the footage to a secure drive before shutting down the feed. "Let's get out of here." The two rushed back to the common room, where Wallace and the others were waiting. Tyler uploaded the footage to the main display and pressed play. The crew watched in silence as the shadow passed across the screen, its sheer size dwarfing the drill equipment. Wallace exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. "Could be a whale," he said, though the words sounded hollow even to him. "That's no whale," Sarah said. "It's too big, and it's moving like it knows we're watching." "We're shutting down the drill," Wallace declared, standing abruptly. "Until we know what's down there, we're not taking any chances." The room fell silent as the implications of his decision sank in. Shutting down the drill was a last resort, one that would draw scrutiny from the company. But no one protested. Whatever was below them wasn't natural, and it wasn't going away. As the team dispersed, Sarah lingered, staring at the screen where the shadow had appeared. The image was gone, but the feeling remained, an undeniable sense that something in the depths had noticed them, and it wasn't finished. The drill had gone silent, its engines stilled by Wallace's orders. For the first time since arriving on Rig A-27, the structure seemed unnaturally quiet, save for the omnipresent hum of generators. The crew moved through the halls with a nervous energy, speaking in hushed tones, as if raising their voices might summon whatever was lurking beneath them. Sarah McAllister took the opportunity to return to the rig's archives. She had been combing through old logs since their discovery of the shadow on the live feed, hoping to piece together the history of A-27. Most entries were mundane: technical updates, supply inventories, personnel changes. But as she delved deeper into the older files, the tone shifted. One entry from 3 years earlier stood out: suspension of operations due to unexplained equipment failures. Divers reported strange sounds near the drill site, requesting additional resources for underwater inspection. Another, dated just months later, was more cryptic: no sign of missing diver. All operations suspended indefinitely. Sarah felt a chill creep up her spine. Why hadn't the company disclosed this? More importantly, why had they decided to reactivate the rig after such ominous incidents? She made a note of the dates and closed the logbook, her mind racing. Meanwhile, on the main deck, Tyler Jenkins and Maria Lopez stood near the railing, staring into the mist. The two had been tasked with routine inspections, though neither could focus. Tyler's hands lingered on a maintenance panel, pretending to adjust it while his eyes darted to the water below. "Do you feel like we're being watched?" Maria asked suddenly, breaking the tense silence. Tyler didn't answer immediately. He'd been feeling it too, that prickling sensation on the back of his neck, like unseen eyes were fixed on him. Finally, he nodded. "Yeah, ever since we saw that footage, it's like something knows we're here." Their conversation was interrupted by a sharp clang. Both jumped, turning toward the sound. A loose chain swung against the side of the rig, its movement unnatural given the lack of wind. The two exchanged uneasy glances before retreating inside. In the control room, Wallace was reviewing the seismic data Maria and Tyler had collected. The rhythmic pulses were growing stronger, and their frequency had increased. "This isn't geological," he muttered under his breath. "What else could it be?" Sarah asked, stepping into the room with the old logbook in hand. Wallace didn't answer, his jaw tightening. He hated not having control of the situation, and whatever was happening here defied all logic. Sarah slid the logbook onto the table, flipping to the troubling entries. This rig was shut down for a reason. A diver went missing, and they never found him. Why didn't we know about this before we came out here? Wallace frowned, scanning the entries. "Because they didn't want us to know," he said finally. "We're not here to ask questions. We're here to drill." "And look where that's gotten us," Sarah shot back. Before Wallace could respond, an alarm blared through the rig, its shrill tone cutting through the tension like a knife. Maria's voice came over the intercom, panicked. "Captain, you need to get to the observation deck. Now!" Wallace bolted from the room, Sarah close behind. When they reached the observation deck, Maria and Tyler were already there, pointing toward the water. The mist had thinned slightly, revealing something horrifying: a cluster of shapes floating near the rig's base. At first, they thought it was debris, but as the shapes drifted closer, the truth became clear. Bodies. Dozens of them. Some were in advanced stages of decay, their features unrecognizable, while others looked disturbingly fresh. Sarah recoiled, covering her mouth. "Oh my God," she whispered. Tyler grabbed a pair of binoculars, scanning the gruesome scene. "There's something tied to them," he said shakily. "Like weights?" Maria shuddered. "Why would someone do this?" Wallace didn't answer. His eyes were locked on the bodies, his mind racing. This wasn't just a natural phenomenon or a mechanical issue. Whatever was happening on Rig A-27 was deliberate, and they were in the middle of it. The mist began to thicken again, swallowing the grisly sight. But as it did, a low, guttural sound rose from the water. It wasn't the pulsing noise from before. It was deeper, angrier, and closer. "Everyone inside," Wallace barked. "Now!" As the crew scrambled back into the safety of the rig, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the warning had been clear. Whatever lay beneath the waves didn't want them there, and it was only a matter of time before it made that point impossible to ignore. Inside Rig A-27, the air was thick with unspoken dread. The events of the previous day, the shadow in the water, the floating bodies, and the ominous hum from below, hung over the crew like a storm cloud. Sarah McAllister sat in the break room with a cold cup of coffee, her thoughts racing. The bodies hadn't just drifted there by chance. Someone or something had sent them as a message. Across the room, Wallace paced like a caged animal, his brow furrowed. His usual air of authority was unraveling, and the crew could see it. "We can't just sit here," he finally said, his voice breaking the oppressive silence. "If we don't figure out what's going on, this rig is dead in the water." "I've already told you," Sarah snapped. "The company knew something was wrong here. They hid it, and now we're paying for their mistakes. We should radio for evacuation." Wallace glared at her. "And tell them what? That the rig is haunted? That we saw something in the water? They'll laugh us off and send a replacement team. We need proof." It was Tyler who hesitantly suggested the next step. "We could use the ROV," he said, referring to the remotely operated underwater vehicle. "If we send it down, we might get a clearer picture of what's causing the seismic activity or whatever else is down there." The crew agreed reluctantly. The ROV was their safest option, a way to explore the depths without sending anyone into the water. Tyler and Maria worked quickly to prepare the submersible, checking its cameras, lights, and tether. Within an hour, it was ready to launch. The control room became a cramped hub of tension as the crew gathered around the monitor displaying the ROV's feed. Tyler operated the controls, guiding the vehicle down through the inky black water. The initial descent was uneventful, the camera capturing nothing but swirling sediment and the faint glimmer of distant fish. At 200 meters, the hum grew louder, vibrating through the rig's metal framework. The crew exchanged uneasy glances as Tyler adjusted the ROV's trajectory. "We're getting close to the drill site," he said, his voice tight. When the ROV reached the ocean floor, the camera revealed a barren, desolate landscape. The drill's massive arms jutted from the seabed like skeletal fingers, surrounded by scattered debris from past operations. At first, there was no sign of anything unusual. Then they saw it. A gaping fissure in the seabed stretched out before them, its edges glowing faintly with an eerie blue light. The light pulsed in time with a rhythmic hum, creating an otherworldly effect that sent chills through the crew. "What is that?" Maria whispered, leaning closer to the screen. "It's not natural," Sarah said, her voice trembling. "It looks alive." As the ROV moved closer to the fissure, the camera feed began to flicker. Static crackled through the speakers, and the hum intensified, becoming almost deafening. Tyler struggled with the controls, but the vehicle refused to respond. "Pull it back," Wallace shouted, but it was too late. The screen went black as the ROV's feed cut out completely. For a moment, the crew sat in stunned silence, the hum now echoing ominously through the rig. Then the room shook violently, throwing them from their chairs. "Earthquake!" Tyler shouted, but Sarah knew better. This wasn't seismic activity, it was something else. The shaking stopped as abruptly as it had started. Alarms blared throughout the rig, warning of structural damage. Wallace grabbed the intercom and barked orders for everyone to secure themselves. But Sarah's attention was fixed on the darkened monitor. The hum had faded, replaced by an unsettling quiet. Whatever had just happened, it wasn't over. And for the first time, Sarah felt certain of one thing. The fissure wasn't just a geological anomaly. It was a doorway, and something on the other side was starting to wake up. The aftermath of the tremor left Rig 827 in disarray. Broken tools, overturned furniture, and the faint smell of burnt wiring painted a grim picture as the crew scrambled to assess the damage. Yet, the external chaos was nothing compared to the storm brewing in their minds. The fissure's pulsating blue glow, the hum that seemed alive, and the ROV's abrupt failure all pointed to a truth no one dared to say aloud. They were dealing with something far beyond their understanding. Wallace convened an emergency meeting in the mess hall, the only area still intact enough to gather the crew. The room was packed with worried faces, their usual bravado stripped away by the escalating tension. Wallace stood at the head of the room, his usual commanding presence diminished by the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. "We're running out of options," he began, his voice heavy. "The ROV is gone, and the tremor has compromised some of the rig systems. We need a plan before things get worse. Worse than this? Maria shot back, her voice trembling. We just lost a multi-million-dollar vehicle to what, a glowing crack in the ocean floor? We need to evacuate. Sarah stood abruptly, holding the logbook she'd been poring over earlier. Evacuating won't solve anything, she said. If we leave now, we'll be handing this mess off to another crew, just like the ones before us. There's a pattern here, disappearances, unexplained phenomena, and now us. She slammed the book onto the table. We need to understand what's down there, or this will keep happening. How do you propose we do that? Tyler asked, his tone laced with frustration. We can't exactly send another ROV down. And I don't know about you, but I'm not diving into that water. Silence fell over the group as the weight of their predicament sank in. Finally, Wallace spoke. We don't have much choice. The rig isn't stable enough to withstand another tremor, and the company won't send rescue unless we prove this isn't operator error. We need evidence. The decision was made reluctantly. A small, manual submersible still housed on the rig would be deployed. Unlike the ROV, this craft required a human pilot. Tyler, the most experienced with the equipment, volunteered. Despite his fear, he couldn't stand the thought of waiting idly while whatever was beneath them threatened to destroy the rig. As Tyler prepared for the descent, the crew gathered in the control room to monitor his progress. The submersible was cramped and outdated, its controls clunky and unresponsive compared to the sleek ROV. Still, Tyler steeled himself, knowing the crew was counting on him. The submersible descended slowly, its lights piercing the murky depths. Through the crackling audio feed, Tyler's voice came through, shaky but determined. Visibility's poor. Can't see much yet. Heading toward the fissure. In the control room, the tension was palpable. The camera feed from the submersible flickered occasionally, but the image held steady. The crew watched as the blue glow of the fissure came into view, pulsating like the heartbeat of some massive, unseen creature. I'm approaching the edge, Tyler reported. The hum is back, louder now. As the submersible neared the fissure, the camera feed picked up something startling. Strange markings etched into the surrounding rock. The symbols were intricate, almost geometric, and pulsed faintly with the same blue light. Do you see this? Tyler asked, his voice rising with a mix of awe and fear. These markings, they're not natural. They look like writing. Before anyone could respond, the submersible shook violently. Tyler's panicked voice came over the feed. Something's pulling me. I can't. The screen went dark, and the audio cut out. In the control room, chaos erupted as the crew frantically tried to re-establish contact. Sarah leaned over the console, shouting into the mic, "Tyler, can you hear me? Respond." Static filled the room, followed by a low, guttural sound that froze everyone in place. It wasn't the hum, it was something else, something alive. The feed crackled back to life, showing the interior of the submersible. Tyler was no longer in his seat. The cockpit was empty, the controls moving on their own. The camera flickered again, this time revealing a glimpse of something outside the submersible, a massive, shadowy figure moving near the fissure. Its form was indistinct, but its sheer size was undeniable. As the image faded once more, the guttural sound grew louder, reverberating through the rig like a warning. Wallace slammed his fist on the console, his voice trembling with uncharacteristic fear. We're not equipped for this. We need to call for evacuation, now. But Sarah's eyes remained fixed on the screen, her mind racing. Whatever had taken Tyler wasn't just a threat, it was a revelation. The fissure wasn't just a geological anomaly or a doorway. It was something far older, far more deliberate, and it was watching them. The loss of Tyler sent a chilling silence over the crew of Rig 827. In the control room, the static-filled monitor loomed like an unblinking eye, a grim reminder of the abyss they were up against. Wallace, normally stoic and commanding, now looked like a man grappling with defeat. The room buzzed with quiet murmurs, the crew voicing fears they'd only dared to think until now. We're calling for evac, Wallace announced, his voice cutting through the din. This isn't salvageable anymore. Tyler's gone, and I'm not losing anyone else to whatever that thing is. Sarah stood, her face pale but resolute. If we leave now, we'll be walking away blind. The company will just send another team, and the same thing will happen. We need to understand what we're dealing with. Wallace rounded on her, his eyes blazing with frustration. Understand what? That there's something down there that shouldn't exist? That it's already taken one of us? This isn't a science expedition, Sarah. This is survival. Before Sarah could respond, the rig shuddered violently, cutting off the power for a split second. When the lights flickered back on, the faint, rhythmic hum returned, but now it seemed to emanate from within the rig itself. Maria froze, her face etched with terror. Do you hear that? It's inside. The hum wasn't just a sound anymore. It seemed to seep into their very bones, vibrating through the walls and floor. Equipment in the control room began to malfunction, screens flickering with static and error codes. The lights dimmed and pulsed, matching the rhythm of the hum. Something's wrong with the systems, Maria said, her hands flying over the console. It's like the rig is responding to the sound. Suddenly, a garbled voice crackled over the intercom. At first, it was unintelligible, a blend of static and deep, guttural tones. Then, unmistakably, Tyler's voice broke through. "Help me," he said, his words distorted but clear enough to send a collective shiver through the crew. Wallace grabbed the mic. "Tyler? Where are you? What's happening?" There was no response, only more static. But then, faintly, Tyler's voice returned, repeating the same phrase. "Help me. It's inside." The intercom went silent, leaving the crew frozen in place. The implication was horrifying. If Tyler was still alive, then whatever had taken him was still connected to the rig. Sarah broke the silence. "He's alive. We can't leave him." "We don't know that," Wallace countered, though his voice lacked conviction. "For all we know, it's not even him. It could be whatever's down there trying to lure us." The debate was interrupted by a loud, metallic bang from deep within the rig. The sound reverberated through the structure, followed by a series of irregular thuds, as if something massive and heavy was moving through the lower levels. "Something's up here," Maria whispered, her face pale. Arming themselves with the limited tools at hand, wrenches, crowbars, and a flare gun, they cautiously made their way toward the source of the noise. The lower decks were bathed in dim, flickering light, the hum growing louder with each step. They found the source in the engine room. One of the massive generators had been torn apart, its inner workings twisted and mangled as if by some great force. Standing near was a figure, Tyler, or what used to be Tyler. His body was pale and bloated, his movements jerky and unnatural. His eyes glowed faintly with the same blue light as the fissure. He turned to face them, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. "Tyler," Sarah said cautiously, stepping forward. He didn't respond. Instead, he raised one hand, pointing toward the ceiling. When he spoke, his voice was layered, as though something else spoke through him. "It's awake," he said. "You've opened the door. You can't leave now." Before anyone could react, Tyler let out a piercing, inhuman scream. The lights around them shattered, plunging the room into darkness as the hum grew deafening. Something unseen rushed past them, knocking them off their feet. When the lights flickered back on, Tyler was gone. In his place was a single, glowing symbol etched into the floor, one of the same markings from the fissure. It pulsed faintly, as if alive, as the hum receded into a chilling silence. Wallace helped Sarah to her feet, his expression a mixture of anger and fear. "We're done here," he said. "This isn't just a rig anymore. It's something else." But Sarah wasn't listening. She stared at the symbol, her mind racing. Whatever had taken Tyler, and now the rig was intelligent, and it wasn't done with them yet. The crew's return to the control room was heavy with silence, each step punctuated by the creaks and groans of the rig, as if it were alive and breathing. The glowing symbol left behind in the engine room seemed to etch itself into their minds, its pulsing light lingering in their vision. Wallace, always the voice of action, had insisted on sealing off the lower levels. But even he knew it was a desperate measure against something far beyond his control. As the team gathered around the console, Maria took the lead in examining the rig systems. The screens were a jumble of errors and unreadable data, overlaid with strange patterns that resembled the markings from the fissure. "The rig systems are changing," Maria said, her voice unsteady. "It's like they're being rewritten. None of this is supposed to happen." "What do you mean, rewritten?" Wallace demanded, leaning over her shoulder. "It's hard to explain," Maria replied, typing furiously to regain control. "The software isn't just glitching, it's being replaced. It's like something else is using the rig's infrastructure to communicate or take control." Sarah, who had been unusually quiet since their encounter in the engine room, finally spoke. "The symbol in the engine room, it's not random. It's a message. Tyler, or whatever Tyler has become," said Weave, opened the door. "Maybe this isn't just a machine anymore. Maybe it's part of whatever's down there." Wallace slammed his fist on the console. "Enough with the theories. We need solutions, not speculation. Can we call for evac or not?" Maria shook her head. "The comms are down and the backup system is compromised. If we want to send a message, we'll have to do it manually through the main antenna. That's in the highest tower," Wallace said grimly. "If this thing is taking over the rig, it won't let us just stroll up there and make a call." The words hung in the air, thick with dread. The crew had already seen the rig behave in ways that defied explanation. The hum, the symbols, Tyler's transformation, it all pointed to an intelligence that wasn't just malevolent but calculating. Determined to take action, Wallace organized the team. He would lead a small group to the antenna tower while Maria stayed behind to monitor the systems. Sarah insisted on joining the tower crew, arguing that her understanding of the symbols might be crucial. Wallace reluctantly agreed, taking Tyler's flare gun as a precaution. The journey to the antenna tower was a gauntlet of unnerving sights and sounds. The rig structure had begun to warp subtly, as if the metal itself were responding to an unseen force. Walls pulsed faintly with the same blue light as the fissure, and the hum followed them, growing louder the higher they climbed. Halfway up the tower, they encountered another symbol. This one was etched into the stairwell, larger and more intricate than the one in the engine room. Sarah stopped to examine it, tracing its lines with trembling fingers. "It's a warning," she said. "Or maybe a command. I think it's trying to guide us. Or control us." Wallace frowned. "Whatever it is, we're not stopping. Let's move." When they finally reached the top, the sight that greeted them was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. The antenna, once a simple, functional structure, had been transformed. Tendrils of glowing blue light snaked around it, pulsating in time with the hum. The air crackled with energy, and the crew could feel the vibrations in their bones. Maria's voice crackled over their handheld radio, distorted and faint. "You're not alone up there," she said. "Something's moving. Wait, the camera's just cut out. Be careful." As if on cue, a shadow emerged from behind the glowing antenna. It was humanoid but wrong, its movements jerky and unnatural. Its skin shimmered faintly with the same blue hue as the symbols, and its eyes glowed like beacons in the darkness. Wallace raised the flare gun, his hands shaking. "Stay back," he shouted, though his voice betrayed his fear. The figure tilted its head, as if studying them. When it spoke, its voice was a blend of multiple tones, some human, some unearthly. "You cannot leave. You belong to it now. To the depths." Sarah stepped forward, her fear giving way to desperate curiosity. What is it? What does it want from us?" The figure didn't answer. Instead, it raised one hand, and the symbols etched into the tower began to glow brighter. The hum grew deafening, and the rig shuddered violently, as though it were trying to shake them off. Wallace fired the flare gun. The projectile struck the figure, engulfing it in a burst of light and flame. For a moment, it seemed to recoil, its form flickering like a malfunctioning hologram. Then it vanished, leaving only the pulsating antenna behind. "Let's get this done," Wallace barked, pulling Sarah back toward the controls. As they worked to restore the antenna, the hum began to subside, replaced by an eerie silence. But the crew knew better than to feel relief. Whatever force had taken hold of the rig wasn't finished with them. It was only waiting for its next move. When they finally sent the distress signal, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that their message would never reach the surface. The rig wasn't just a victim of this force, it was part of it now. And as they descended the tower, the symbols seemed to glow brighter, as if mocking their attempts to escape. Down below, Maria stared at the monitors, her face pale as she whispered into the radio. "You need to hurry back. Something's happening. It's spreading." The rig had become a living entity, and they were trapped in its grip. As Wallace and his team descended from the antenna tower, the rig seemed to breathe with an unnatural cadence. Every stair they took reverberated with a pulsating hum that had become louder, deeper, and more deliberate. It was no longer the background noise of a failing machine. It was a heartbeat. The metallic walls vibrated faintly, and faint streaks of blue light coursed through the metal, as if veins had formed within the structure itself. Maria's voice crackled over the handheld radio, urgency breaking through the static. "Get back here quickly. The lower levels are." The signal distorted into a burst of shrieking feedback, and then silence. "Maria? Maria? Do you copy?" Wallace barked into the radio, shaking it as if physical force could restore the connection. There was no response. "She said the lower levels," Sarah said, her voice tight with unease. "What's happening down there?" Wallace grit his teeth, motioning for them to pick up the pace. The descent was tense, each step accompanied by the growing sense that the rig was no longer just a structure. Something was watching them. The shadows seemed to move, coalescing in corners and stretching unnaturally long under the weak emergency lights. By the time they reached the main deck, the change was undeniable. What was once solid steel now looked organic. The walls bulged in places, their surfaces rippling as if responding to unseen stimuli. Strange, jagged growths jutted out of the floor, glowing faintly with the same eerie blue light. When they reached the control room, Maria was there, hunched over the console. The screens, which once displayed technical data, now showed an unintelligible jumble of symbols and static. She didn't look up when they entered. "Maria!" Wallace called out, rushing toward her. He froze mid-step. Her shoulders were shaking, not from fear, but from silent sobbing. "I can't stop it," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "It's rewriting everything. Our systems, the rig, even us." Wallace frowned, stepping closer. "What are you talking about? What's happening to the lower levels?" Maria slowly turned to face him, and the team recoiled. Her eyes glowed faintly blue, the same hue that had marked Tyler before his transformation. Her skin had taken on a translucent sheen, with faint patterns moving beneath the surface, as if something alien was growing within her. "Maria, what the hell?" Wallace started, but Maria interrupted him. "It's not just the rig," she said, her voice eerily calm. "It's inside us now." Tyler wasn't an accident. He was the beginning. Before anyone could respond, a loud, mechanical groan echoed through the room. The rig shook violently, and the console exploded in a shower of sparks, sending Maria tumbling to the floor. Sarah screamed as a jagged growth erupted from the center of the room, its surface pulsating with light. "We need to move," Wallace shouted, grabbing Sarah and pulling her toward the exit. The room was coming apart, metal twisting and splitting as if consumed by the alien growth. Maria remained on the floor, unmoving, her glowing eyes fixed on the ceiling. As the team stumbled into the corridor, the rig's transformation became even more grotesque. The walls were no longer solid but semi-translucent, revealing shifting forms and patterns within. The once familiar layout of the rig was distorted. Hallways bent at unnatural angles, and staircases led to dead ends or disappeared entirely. "We're not going to make it out of here," Sarah muttered, her voice trembling. "We have to keep moving," Wallace snapped. "There has to be a way out." They made their way toward the living quarters, hoping to regroup and find supplies. But when they arrived, the sight before them froze them in their tracks. The walls of the living quarters had split open, revealing a vast, pulsating chamber that seemed far larger than the rig could possibly contain. Suspended within it were shapes, human shapes. "It's the crew," Sarah whispered, horrified. The figures were encased in the glowing blue material, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. Among them was Tyler, his body now completely consumed by the alien substance. His eyes snapped open as they approached, glowing with unnatural light. "You shouldn't have come here," his voice echoed, though his lips didn't move. "You opened the door, and now it won't close." Wallace raised the flare gun, but Tyler's form dissolved into the chamber walls before he could fire. The rig trembled violently, the hum growing deafening. "It's awake," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. "The rig, it's alive." And as the chamber pulsed around them, Wallace realized she was right. They weren't just fighting for survival anymore. They were fighting against something far beyond their comprehension. The rig had become something else, something alive, and it wasn't going to let them leave. The atmosphere inside the rig had shifted from unsettling to purely malevolent. Every sound was distorted, amplified, as if the very air itself was alive, humming with an oppressive energy. Wallace felt the weight of this new reality pressing in on him. The sense that every step he took was being watched, monitored by something far older and more intelligent than any of them could fathom. The rig was no longer a mechanical structure. It was an entity, one that had awakened and now desired something from them, something they could not comprehend. They had managed to escape the chamber with the suspended crew, though Wallace knew it was only a matter of time before the rig's unnatural force would catch up with them. He had seen the way the walls moved, the way the glowing blue substance flowed like blood through the veins of the station. It was as if the rig had begun to think, to anticipate their every move. No matter which way they turned, the air seemed to hum with an inescapable pressure, as though the very molecules were alive, suffocating them with each breath. "Where do we go now?" Sarah whispered, her voice small and lost amidst the loud, vibrating hum of the rig. Wallace did not answer immediately. He was focused on the corridors ahead, watching the way the lights flickered above, casting erratic shadows that seemed to dance with a life of their own. There was no clear path. Every hallway looked the same. Every turn led them to a dead end, or worse, in a deeper chaos. But one thing was clear. The deeper they went into the rig, the more it seemed to shift, as though the very walls were alive, growing, and learning. "We need to find the core," Wallace finally muttered, mostly to himself. He had no real plan, but they had to try something, anything to understand what was happening and to stop it. The core was the heart of the rig, the place where all systems converged. It was where everything started, where the power came from. If they could reach it, maybe they could shut it down, maybe they could stop whatever was happening to the crew. The crew. Wallace couldn't shake the image of Tyler's body, suspended and consumed by the blue growth. The expression frozen on his face, not just of terror, but of something else, something incomprehensible. Was it possible? Was Tyler aware of what had happened to him? Was he still inside, trapped within that monstrous form? "We'll find it," Wallace said more firmly, shaking the thought from his mind. They couldn't afford to fall into despair. There had to be a way out. As they made their way deeper into the rig, the feeling of being watched became more intense. It was as if the walls were closing in on them, shifting with every step they took. Every hallway felt narrower, more constricting, and in the distance they could hear it, voices. The faintest echoes of conversation, whispers that seemed to travel on the edges of their perception. At first, Wallace thought it was just the wind, the creaking of metal. But then, as they neared the central maintenance area, the whispers grew clearer. "I told you," Sarah said, her voice strained. "There's something else on this rig. Something we didn't bring with us?" Wallace turned to face her, meeting her eyes with a cold, knowing gaze. "I know. We're not alone anymore." The voices were growing louder now. They could hear words, fragments of sentences. But the more they listened, the more disjointed they became, as though the rig itself was trying to communicate, trying to call them closer. Every corner they turned, the voices shifted, morphing into new patterns, like something trying to coax them forward, beckoning them to an unknown destination. Then, a sharp metallic screech echoed through the corridor, followed by a violent tremor that shook the very foundations of the rig. Wallace stumbled but caught himself on the wall, his heart pounding in his chest. The lights flickered, and in that brief moment of darkness, a sound that was unmistakable, a low growl, a rumble that seemed to come from deep within the bowels of the rig itself. "It's here," Wallace said, his voice hoarse. He turned to Sarah, whose eyes were wide with fear. "We need to move. Now." They ran, each footfall reverberating through the twisting corridors, as the sound of the growl grew louder. It wasn't a machine, it was something alive, something breathing. The walls around them seemed to pulse, to shift, as though the rig was responding to their panic. The whispers had grown into screams, voices overlapping in a maddening cacophony, echoing through the halls. Wallace's mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening. Could the rig be alive? Had it become sentient? Ahead of them, a door swung open. Without thinking, Wallace grabbed Sarah's arm, pulling her into the room just as the growl reached its peak. They slammed the door behind them, hearts pounding, hands slick with sweat. The room they'd entered was small and dimly lit, but what caught Wallace's attention was what was in the center: a console, a strange array of blinking lights, and more of the glowing blue substance. It pulsed with an almost rhythmic intensity. "We're close," Wallace whispered, stepping forward, his breath catching in his throat. He had no idea what the console was for, but something told him this was the heart of the rig, the core he had been searching for. But before he could reach it, the door behind them began to tremble, and the growl erupted again, louder this time, accompanied by a thundering crash. The rig was coming for them, and there would be no escaping it this time. It had them trapped. In that moment, Wallace understood the terrible truth. The rig wasn't just a structure. It was a predator, and they were its prey. And in its hollow, echoing depths, there was no escape. The room they had locked themselves in felt both safe and suffocating, a paradox that gnawed at Wallace's sense of reality. The growls reverberated through the walls, a constant reminder of the malevolent force closing in on them. The blue substance pulsated on the console before him, alive in a way he could neither explain nor understand. He stared at the shifting lights, his mind racing through possibilities, none of them comforting. There was no way to control this, no way to fix it. Wallace's hands trembled as he placed them on the console, the lights flickering in response, almost as if acknowledging his presence. The air in the room grew colder, and a low hum began to emanate from the walls, a sound that seemed to vibrate deep within his chest. It was becoming impossible to tell whether the hum was coming from the rig itself or from his mind, a trick of exhaustion and terror. The pressure was unbearable. The walls felt as if they were closing in, and the whispers were growing louder. "Wallace," Sarah's voice broke through the haze of panic, soft but urgent. "What are you doing? We can't just stand here. The rig, this thing, is alive. It's not just the walls or the machines. It's something else." He turned to face her, her pale face lit by the flickering lights. She looked as drained as he felt, her eyes wide with fear. But there was something else, something sharper in her gaze now. They had been through so much in such a short time, and yet, here they were, trapped inside a metal death trap, struggling to make sense of the madness surrounding them. "I know," Wallace replied, his voice hollow. "But if we don't try something, we're all going to die here. I think the core is connected to everything. It's what's keeping the rig alive. If we can find out how to stop it, maybe we can stop all of this." Sarah's lips trembled, and for a moment, Wallace thought she might break down. But she didn't. Instead, she squared her shoulders and nodded. "Then let's find out how to shut it down. I don't care what it takes anymore." They approached the console together, their hands hovering over the strange interface. The glowing blue substance seemed to react to their touch, flickering and changing colors as if it was alive. Each time they moved, the entire rig seemed to shift with them, the walls groaning and the floor creaking under their feet. It was as though the rig was responding to them, analyzing them, deciding if they were worth keeping alive. Wallace's stomach twisted in response to the thought. "This doesn't feel right," Sarah whispered, her voice trembling. She took a step back, her eyes scanning the room. "It feels like we're feeding into it, like we're making it stronger." Maybe, Wallace said, trying to push the creeping doubt from his mind. But if we don't act, it'll kill us anyway. We have no choice. But just as he spoke, a new sound cut through the tension, distant but unmistakable. It was the unmistakable sound of footsteps, heavy and deliberate, moving in their direction. Wallace's heart skipped a beat as the realization hit him. They weren't alone in the room anymore. The door burst open with a deafening crash, and before they could react, a figure emerged from the shadows, a silhouette, tall and distorted, its features impossible to make out. Wallace's breath caught in his throat. It was one of the crew members, or at least it used to be. The figure's body was twisted, its limbs bent at unnatural angles, and its skin was slick with a strange, glowing substance, the same blue material that seemed to be everywhere on the rig. Its eyes, or what was left of them, glowed with an eerie, otherworldly light. For a moment, it stood there, as if trying to understand what it had become. Then, it took a step toward them, its mouth opening in a silent scream, a grotesque and unnatural sound that made Wallace's stomach churn. "Tyler," Wallace whispered, his voice cracking. But the creature, Tyler if it still was, did not respond. Instead, it let out a low, guttural growl, the sound reverberating through the room as it took another step forward. Its movements were jerky, mechanical, like a puppet controlled by invisible strings. Wallace instinctively stepped back, his heart pounding, his mind racing. He couldn't understand what had happened. Was this what had become of the crew? Were they all turning into these things? "Sarah, we need to go." "Now," Wallace said, his voice urgent. But Sarah was frozen, her eyes locked onto the creature, her face pale. Wallace grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the exit, but she didn't move. She was paralyzed with fear, as if rooted to the spot by the sheer horror of what she was witnessing. "Sarah!" Wallace shouted, shaking her. The sound of the growl grew louder, and the air seemed to thicken with each passing second. The creature took another step forward, its hand reaching out, its fingers elongated and twisted. Wallace could feel the oppressive weight of it pressing down on him, as if the entire rig was holding its breath, waiting for something. But what? Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature stopped. Its head tilted to one side, and for a brief moment, it seemed to focus on Wallace and Sarah, its glowing eyes boring into them. There was no recognition in those eyes, just a cold, calculated emptiness. And then, without warning, it turned and began to shuffle away, its movements slow but deliberate. Wallace didn't wait to find out why. He yanked Sarah in motion, forcing her to run. They didn't know where they were going, didn't know if there was any escape, but they couldn't stay there. Not with that thing roaming the rig. As they ran, the growls and whispers seemed to follow them, building to a deafening crescendo, as if the rig itself was alive, aware of their every movement. The air was thick with tension, and every step felt like it might be their last. The deeper they went, the harder it became to tell if they were truly escaping or simply running deeper into the trap the rig had set for them. But one thing was clear: they couldn't go back. There was no safety. There was only the relentless pursuit of something ancient and terrifying, something that had waited long enough to finally awaken. As Wallace and Sarah fled deeper into the labyrinth of the oil rig, the sense of being pursued grew heavier with each step. The claustrophobic corridors, once familiar and comforting to the crew, now felt like a maze of shifting, distorted dimensions. Each hallway seemed to stretch further into the unknown, twisting upon itself, as though the rig itself had become sentient, playing a sinister game with them. The wall seemed to close in tighter with every turn, and yet there was no sign of escape. The footsteps behind them grew fainter, and for a brief, fleeting moment, they dared to believe they had lost the creature. But the tension in the air, thick and suffocating, suggested otherwise. It was as if they were still being watched, as if the rig itself had grown aware of their every movement. Wallace's breath came in sharp, ragged gasps, his mind racing to make sense of what had just happened. Who, or what was that thing? It couldn't have been Tyler, could it? What had happened to him? What was happening to everyone on this rig? Wallace sighed. Sarah's voice trailed off, her words strangled by fear. "I know," Wallace replied, his voice tight. "We need to get to the central hub. We need to figure out what this thing is and how to stop it." They had reached a set of stairs that led downward, deeper into the rig's underbelly. The elevator was no longer an option. The power to it had long since been cut off. The stairwell seemed impossibly long, the darkness below swallowing them up. But the fear of being trapped in the upper levels, exposed to whatever horrors lurked, pushed them onward. "I don't think we should go down there," Sarah said, her voice laced with uncertainty. "It feels like we're walking into something we don't understand. Something watching us." Wallace stopped at the top of the stairs, looking down into the inky blackness. The air smelled faintly of oil and metal, but underneath it, there was something else, something putrid, as though decay had begun to set in. "We don't have a choice. We can't go back. We'll be caught." But as he spoke, a sudden noise erupted from below, a low, rumbling sound, deep and unsettling, as though something vast was stirring in the very core of the rig. The walls seemed to vibrate with the sound, and the floor beneath their feet groaned, as though the entire structure was groaning in response to an unseen force. It was an unnatural sound, one that seemed to reverberate through their bones, filling them with dread. Wallace's mind raced, his instincts screaming at him to run, to flee. But where could they go? They were trapped. The rig had become a living, breathing entity, and it seemed to be closing in on them. "We need to find the control room. It's our only chance." Sarah didn't respond immediately. She was staring into the darkness below, her eyes wide and fixed on something unseen. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Wallace followed her gaze, but there was nothing there, just the oppressive blackness, pressing in on them from all sides. Yet the feeling of being watched intensified, crawling under his skin, making his heart pound in his chest. There was something down there, something that had been waiting for them. Suddenly, the sound came again, louder this time. A scraping, shuffling noise, as though something heavy was dragging itself across the floor. The sound was coming from the depths of the stairwell, from the very heart of the rig. Wallace's blood ran cold. There was no question now. The rig was alive, and it was hunting them. "Sarah, move," he shouted, grabbing her by the arm and pulling her toward the stairs. They ran, their feet pounding on the metal steps, each one echoing through the darkness. The sound behind them grew louder, closer, as though something was coming for them, something that was not quite human, not quite anything they could understand. Wallace glanced over his shoulder, and for just a brief moment, he thought he saw a figure standing in the shadows. A tall silhouette, its face obscured by the darkness, watching them with cold, unblinking eyes. The moment passed, but the sense of being hunted didn't. It was as though the entire rig was alive, shifting, adjusting to their every movement. The walls seemed to close in around them, pushing them forward, urging them deeper into the bowels of the oil rig. There was no turning back now. The further they descended, the colder the air became. It felt as if they were walking into an abyss, a place where time itself had ceased to exist. The world above, with its echoes of life, was fading away, replaced by an unnatural stillness. The hum of the rig, once a background noise, had faded into a low, ominous silence, as though everything had paused, waiting for something. When they finally reached the bottom, the sight that greeted them was like something from a nightmare. The central hub of the rig, a vast, darkened room filled with rows of machinery, was eerily quiet. But it was not empty. The space was filled with shadows, distorted shapes moving just out of their reach. And there, in the center of the room, stood a massive, glowing machine. Its core pulsed with an unnatural blue light, and it hummed with a steady rhythm, like the heartbeat of the rig itself. The moment they stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind them with a deafening crash, trapping them in the heart of the rig. The hum of the machine grew louder, as if it recognized their presence, and the shadows around them began to take form, shifting in unnatural ways. Wallace's heart raced, his mind struggling to comprehend the horror before him. The rig wasn't just alive, it was something worse, something ancient. And as the shadows converged on them, Wallace realized the true nature of their predicament. They weren't just trapped in a rig, they were trapped in a nightmare, and the rig itself was the nightmare. As the door slammed shut behind them, sealing them inside the heart of the oil rig, Wallace and Sarah stood frozen, their minds racing to grasp the magnitude of their situation. The machine in front of them pulsed ominously, its blue light casting long, shifting shadows across the room. The once familiar hum of the rig now sounded like the distorted heartbeat of a creature far beyond their comprehension. The shadows around them twisted and shifted as if alive, moving in ways that defied the laws of nature. For a moment, everything seemed to hold its breath, the very air thick with tension. The room felt too large, too cavernous for the space they occupied, as though it were growing, expanding to contain something far greater than the oil rig itself. Wallace could feel the oppressive weight of the space pressing in on them, his chest tightening with each passing second. The suffocating silence was more than just the absence of sound. It felt as if the rig had taken all sound, all life, and had consumed it. The ritual of silence was beginning, and it was far too late to escape. Sarah, her face pale, slowly backed away from the glowing machine, her eyes wide with terror. "Wallace, what is that thing?" she whispered, her voice shaking. Her words seemed to disappear into the silence, swallowed by the unnatural stillness that had taken over. Wallace didn't have an answer. He had seen things, heard things that defied explanation, but this was different. This was something ancient, something that had been buried deep within the bowels of the earth, something that had been awakened by their presence. He had thought the rig was alive before, but now it was clear. It was something else entirely. The rig was a vessel, a temple, a place of dark and forgotten rituals that reach back to a time before human existence. "I don't know," Wallace said, his voice low and strained. "But I think we're supposed to activate it. We've been led here somehow. Everything that's happened, the disappearing crew, the whispers in the dark, it's all been leading us to this moment." The sound of shuffling feet drew their attention to the far side of the room. As they turned, they saw the shadows growing more distinct, now taking the form of human figures, though their features were twisted and indistinct. They were tall, unnaturally so, and their movements were jerky, as though they were puppets pulled by unseen strings. The figures were silent, but the weight of their gaze was palpable. They were watching, waiting. Wallace's heart pounded as he realized the truth. They weren't alone. The crew, or what was left of them, were not merely dead or missing. They had been transformed, turned into something else by the very forces they had awakened. The ritual had begun, and they were its unwilling participants. "Sarah, listen to me," Wallace said urgently, his voice barely more than a whisper. "We need to stop this. Whatever it is, it's feeding on our fear, on our confusion. We need to break the cycle before it's too late." But Sarah was already stepping forward, drawn toward the glowing machine as if in a trance. Her movements were slow, deliberate, as though she were being pulled by an unseen force. Wallace called her name, but she didn't respond. Her eyes were fixed on the machine, her expression blank. "Sarah!" Wallace shouted, rushing forward to grab her arm. But the moment his hand touched her, the shadows around them reacted. The figures in the corners of the room shifted, their attention now fully on Wallace. The air seemed to thicken, as if something was pressing down on him, suffocating him. The shadows flickered like flames, and for a brief moment, Wallace saw something else, something far worse than he had imagined. The figures were no longer just shadows. They were reflections of something deeper, something primordial. They were fragments of an ancient being, a god long forgotten, a creature of the earth that had been sealed away beneath the rig, waiting for the right moment to emerge. The machine in the center of the room was its heart, its anchor to the physical world. The realization struck Wallace like a blow to the chest. This wasn't a matter of survival anymore. They weren't just trapped on an oil rig. They had stumbled upon the threshold of an ancient and malevolent force, one that had been slumbering for millennia, waiting for the right moment to return. And that moment had arrived. He grabbed Sarah by the shoulders, shaking her hard. "Sarah, listen to me. You have to fight it. We have to fight it." But her eyes remained vacant, her body unmoving, as though she were no longer there. Suddenly, the ground beneath them trembled. The rig, the machine, the very foundation of the place seemed to be alive, reacting to their presence. The shadows closed in tighter, the figures now surrounding them, their eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. Wallace could feel the rig shaking, as though it were being pulled apart, its very structure unable to contain the force that was awakening beneath it. Then, the blue light of the machine flared, blindingly bright, and for a moment, Wallace thought he could hear the sound of distant chanting, voices, ancient and guttural, speaking in a language that made his blood run cold. The ritual was reaching its climax. In that moment, Wallace understood the truth. They were not just here by accident. They were part of the ritual, the final sacrifice to bring this ancient force back into the world. The rig was no longer a place of work. It was a conduit, a portal for something far older and more powerful than they could comprehend. And the shadows, the figures, were the heralds of its return. There was no escape. The only question now was whether Wallace would survive long enough to see the full horror of what they had unleashed. The moment the blue light from the machine began to flicker and pulse, the very fabric of reality seemed to shift. It was as if the rig itself was no longer bound by the natural laws that had governed it for so long. The hum of the machinery, which had once been an omnipresent, comforting background noise, had now turned into a low, throbbing pulse that echoed deep in Wallace's chest. It was the sound of something ancient awakening, and the realization that they were standing on the precipice of an unimaginable horror struck him with full force. The shadows surrounding them grew more distinct, now taking on features. Eyes, mouths, twisted, contorted faces that seemed to leer at him from all directions. Their figures were no longer just strange silhouettes, but had taken on a form that was almost human. Almost. Their limbs were elongated, impossibly thin, and their movements were jerky, as though they were struggling to exist in a world that they didn't quite belong to. But their eyes, those hollow, black eyes, were filled with a malevolent intelligence that sent a shiver down his spine. Wallace tried to pull Sarah away from the machine, but her body felt like stone. She was frozen in place, her face an eerie mask of blankness, her eyes unblinking and distant. It was as if she had been claimed by whatever force resided within the rig, her will no longer her own. The air around them seemed to thicken, pressing down on Wallace as though the very weight of the situation was pushing him toward an inescapable conclusion. He shouted her name again, his voice cracking with desperation. "Sarah, fight it. You have to fight it." But there was no response. She stood there, unyielding, her eyes locked onto the machine as though it were the only thing that mattered in the world. The ground beneath them trembled again, and for a moment, Wallace thought he could hear a low, guttural growl reverberating through the rig. It was a sound so deep, so primal, that it seemed to resonate with something deep within his bones. He stumbled backward, his heart racing, as the rig continued to shake and groan under the pressure of whatever force was being unleashed. Then, the figures around them began to move. Slowly at first, but with increasing speed. They were closing in. Wallace's instinct screamed at him to run, to flee, but there was nowhere to go. The exit was no longer an option. The path they had taken had been blocked, and he could feel the weight of the decision that lay before him. In that moment, Wallace understood the full extent of their situation. There was no escape from the ritual. The machine in front of him was a conduit, a vessel for something far older than anything he had ever encountered. Whatever had been awakened by their intrusion into the rig was not a force to be reasoned with. It was a god, or something close to it, an ancient being whose power stretched beyond time and space. The shadows reached out, their tendrils snaking toward him, and Wallace felt a sudden, unbearable pressure in his chest. He gasped for air, his breath coming in shallow, panicked bursts, as if the very air was being sucked from his lungs. And yet, the choice that he had to make was clear. He could run, try to escape, and leave Sarah behind, or he could face whatever horrors awaited him and attempt to break the ritual. It was a choice that no one should ever have to make, yet here it was, thrust upon him by forces far beyond his understanding. Wallace was no longer sure of what was real or what was illusion. The shadows had blurred the lines between them, and the rig itself had become a nightmarish labyrinth where time no longer flowed in a straight line. The place they were standing in was no longer just a structure. It had become a living entity, its pulse beating with an ominous rhythm that seemed to resonate with the very fabric of his soul. The air grew colder, and for a brief, fleeting moment, Wallace could hear the faint sound of whispers, voices that seemed to be calling his name, beckoning him toward the machine. It was the same voice that had echoed through the rig, the voice that had been behind the whispers he'd heard since the first day they'd arrived. But now, it was clearer, more insistent, and it carried with it the weight of inevitability. "Join us, Wallace. Join us, and you will be free." The words reverberated in his mind, seeping into his thoughts, wrapping around his consciousness like a vice. The voice was sweet, soothing even, but beneath it was an undertone of something darker, something that promised not freedom, but oblivion. Wallace felt a pang of guilt. He had dragged Sarah into this. She had trusted him, followed him into this nightmare, and now she was lost to him, a mere vessel for whatever force had taken hold of the rig. He had failed her, and now the choice had become even harder. If he stayed, he might lose himself too, but if he ran, he would leave her behind forever. The weight of his indecision hung heavy in the air, and for a long moment, he stood there, paralyzed by the enormity of what lay before him. Finally, the decision came. Wallace knew what he had to do. There was no escaping this place. There was no running. He would have to face the force that had claimed the rig, confront it head-on, and find a way to break the ritual. It was their only hope, but there was one catch. If he failed, the rig would consume them both, and whatever dark power was sealed within it would be unleashed upon the world. Wallace turned back to Sarah, her vacant eyes still staring at the machine. He reached out and touched her hand, hoping for some sign that she was still there, still alive in some way. There was no response, but he didn't have time to dwell on that now. He had a choice to make, and it was one that would determine not only their fate, but the fate of everything beyond the rig's walls. The ritual of silence was about to reach its climax, and Wallace had to decide whether to embrace it or to fight against it with everything he had left. As Wallace stood before Sarah, feeling the weight of his decision pressing down on him, the rig itself seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for him to make the inevitable choice. The once familiar surroundings had become a twisted version of themselves, an impossible landscape where the laws of nature no longer applied. Shadows clung to the walls, bending unnaturally as if alive, creeping toward him, whispering threats in languages he couldn't comprehend. The temperature had dropped drastically, and his breath formed visible clouds in the air, but it wasn't the cold that made him shiver. It was the sensation that he was no longer alone. Something had been watching them since they had set foot on the rig, something ancient, something waiting for this very moment. The machine at the center of the room pulsed with a sickly blue glow, its hum growing louder, filling the air with a vibrating, almost tangible tension. Wallace could feel the very air around him thrumming with energy, as if the entire space were a charged battery, waiting for the spark that would set it off. It was an energy he could not explain, one that went beyond science, beyond any rational understanding. His mind raced as he thought of all the theories he had come up with over the past few days. None of them mattered now. None of it mattered, because the reality of what he faced was far beyond anything his human mind could comprehend. Sarah's vacant stare was unsettling. Her body stood frozen, unmoving, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths, but there was no sign of life in her eyes. It was as if she had been hollowed out, her soul consumed by whatever had been awakened on this rig. Wallace's heart clenched in despair. He had failed her. He had brought her into this nightmare, and now she was a mere shell, a puppet controlled by an ancient force. His chest tightened as he fought the urge to scream in frustration. But there was no time for that. There was only one thing left to do, and he had no choice but to do it. He turned away from Sarah and approached the machine, the source of all this chaos. The glow grew brighter as he stepped closer, the shadows around him retreating as if afraid of the power radiating from the machine. It was then that Wallace saw it, an inscription, barely visible beneath the layers of grime and dust that had accumulated over the years. The letters were ancient, unfamiliar to him, but there was a sense of recognition, a sense that he had seen them before. He didn't know how or when, but he knew that those symbols held the key to understanding everything. They were the last remnants of a civilization that had long since disappeared, a culture that had embraced the machine in the hopes of mastering forces far beyond their control. His fingers hovered over the strange carvings, as though the symbols themselves were alive, reacting to his touch. For a moment, he hesitated, afraid of what might happen if he disturbed them. But then he realized something. The ritual had already begun. There was no turning back. The machine was already awake, and whatever had been waiting to escape would not stop until it had its due. The question was no longer whether he should activate the machine, it was how he could stop it. How could he undo the damage that had been done? Wallace's mind flickered back to the story Sarah had told him during their time on the rig. She had always spoken of the strange occurrences, the inexplicable events that had happened during their time at sea. People had gone missing, equipment had malfunctioned, and there had been whispers of a curse, of something older than the rig itself. But they had laughed it off. They had all laughed. No one had taken it seriously. Now, standing before this ancient, monstrous machine, Wallace realized just how foolish they had been. They had been blind to the signs, and now the price was being paid. With a deep breath, Wallace made his decision. He would have to act quickly. He had to disrupt the machine, sever the connection between it and whatever force it was channeling. The glowing symbols seemed to pulse in response to his presence, as if they were anticipating his next move. He could feel the weight of the machine pressing down on him, its power suffocating, but he couldn't back down. Not now. Not when Sarah's life was hanging in the balance. He reached out and touched the symbols, the cold metal of the machine, sending a shock through his fingertips. For a split second, he thought he had made a mistake. But then, the machine roared to life. The sound was deafening, a low, guttural vibration that seemed to come from the depths of the earth itself. The walls of the rig shook violently, as if the very foundation of the platform was being torn apart. Wallace staggered, his body threatening to collapse under the force of the machine's awakening. He could hear Sarah's voice, faint, distant, calling out to him from across the room. But her voice was no longer the same. It was laced with something darker, something that chilled him to the bone. The shadows around him surged forward, coiling like serpents, their eyes glowing with a malevolent light. The rig was no longer a place of work. It had become a battleground, a place where the ancient forces that had once slumbered beneath the earth were now free to claim their prize. Wallace's heart raced as he realized what had happened. The machine had become a beacon, a conduit through which the ancient, malevolent entity could enter the world. But that wasn't the worst part. No, the worst part was the sudden, overwhelming realization that Wallace himself had become part of the ritual. His very presence here, his touch on the machine, had sealed his fate. There was no escaping the abyss now. There was only the choice of how deep he would descend. As the shadows closed in around him, Wallace knew that there was no going back. He had made the decision to face whatever horrors awaited him, but now the cost was clear. The rig, the machine, and everything it had unleashed had already begun to consume him. He was no longer just a man caught in a nightmare. He was part of the nightmare itself. And as the darkness consumed the room, Wallace's thoughts turned to Sarah. He had failed her, but perhaps there was still a chance to save her. Even in the face of such unimaginable horror, he had to hold on to that sliver of hope, no matter how small it seemed. The shadows closed in tighter, and Wallace's vision blurred as the darkness swallowed him whole. The oppressive silence that followed Wallace's descent into the machine's clutches was deafening. It was a silence so profound that it seemed to stretch beyond the limits of the rig, beyond the boundaries of time and space. In that moment, it was as if reality itself had taken a step back, waiting to see how far Wallace would fall. The rig, once a symbol of industrial achievement, now stood as a grotesque monument to something far older, something far more sinister. The machine was alive, and with it, the darkness had begun to leak out, infecting the very air around them. Wallace's mind swirled with confusion. Was this his doing? Was this what he had awakened? The cold, metallic walls around him seemed to press in tighter, as if mocking him. The rig had become something unrecognizable, a place of nightmares. The faint glow of the machine cast long, jagged shadows across the floor, distorting the shape of every object it touched. It was as if the very nature of the rig itself had shifted, had taken on a malevolent will of its own. And with each passing second, that will grew stronger, more tangible. The shadows continued to dance around him, their movements slow, deliberate, and filled with purpose. Wallace felt an overwhelming sense of dread as the darkness seemed to grow in strength, as if it were alive and feeding on his fear. His thoughts raced, trying to make sense of what had just happened. He had been in control, hadn't he? But now, the machine and its force had taken over, and he was nothing more than a bystander to its will. Sarah, who had once stood as a pillar of reason in this madness, was nowhere to be seen. Had she been consumed by the machine as well? Or had she already fallen into the abyss, her soul lost to whatever ancient power was awakening? Despite the terror that gripped him, Wallace's mind fought against the darkness. He couldn't give in to despair, not yet, not when there was still a chance. But how could he possibly fight something so powerful, so beyond human comprehension? The reality of the situation was dawning on him now, more fully than ever. This was no ordinary machine. This was an instrument of destruction, a relic of a time before humanity had even come to be. It was a weapon, not just in the physical sense, but in the metaphysical. It had been designed not to mine the earth for oil, but to tap into something far deeper, something buried in the very heart of the planet, something that should have never been disturbed. For the first time since setting foot on this cursed rig, Wallace understood the true nature of their mission. It had never been about oil. It had never been about resources or profit. No, the true purpose of the rig was far darker. The oil had been a cover, a distraction. The real reason for its existence was to harness the force buried beneath, to use the machine to unlock something ancient and powerful. And in doing so, they had unleashed a nightmare far worse than any of them could have imagined. Wallace's thoughts turned to the crew members who had gone missing, one by one, over the course of the past few months. At the time, he had chalked it up to the dangers of offshore work, accidents, mishaps, equipment failures. But now, he realized with a sinking feeling in his chest, those disappearances had not been random. They had been sacrifices. Each person who had vanished had been drawn into the machine's orbit, and their lives had been consumed by whatever force it had been tapping into. Wallace had been blind to it all, too focused on the day-to-day operations of the rig to see the bigger picture. But now, as the full extent of their situation unfolded, he could see it clearly. They had all been pawns in a much larger game. His eyes snapped back to the machine, its pulsating glow now an eerie, rhythmic heartbeat that seemed to echo in his mind. He could feel it calling to him, beckoning him toward it, urging him to understand, to accept its power. And yet, a part of him resisted, desperately trying to push the thought away. He couldn't give in, not like Sarah had. He couldn't let the machine consume him the way it had consumed her. There had to be another way. There had to be a way to destroy it, to stop it before it was too late. But as Wallace moved toward the machine, his heart racing, the shadows seemed to shift, closing in around him. The air thickened, and a cold sweat broke out on his forehead. The darkness wasn't just a physical presence. It was a living, breathing entity. And it was aware of him. He could feel its eyes on him, watching him with malevolent intent. His breath hitched as the shadows seemed to reach out, like hands, fingers that sought to pull him into their grasp. The machine's hum grew louder, its energy becoming more palpable, until it was no longer just a sound. It was a force, a pressure in the air that made it difficult to think, to breathe. For a moment, Wallace felt as though he might pass out, overcome by the sheer weight of the malevolent power that surrounded him. But he couldn't afford to lose control. Not now. He had come too far. He had made too many mistakes to let it all end like this. With every ounce of strength he had left, Wallace fought back against the pressure, against the shadows that sought to claim him. He reached for the nearest tool, anything to break the machine's hold on him. But his hands were trembling, his body unsteady. It was as if the very act of reaching out to touch the machine was a violation, an invitation for something darker to take hold. Just as his fingers brushed against the cold metal, a sharp, painful jolt ran through his body, and he stumbled back, his vision blurring. The machine had reacted, but instead of destroying him, it had done something worse. It had marked him. The symbols on the machine flashed brighter, and a voice, not human, but somehow familiar, whispered in his mind. It wasn't a voice he could understand, not in any language he knew, but it was unmistakably clear. He had been chosen. The machine had claimed him, just as it had claimed Sarah. And in that moment, Wallace realized the truth that had been hiding in plain sight all along. There was no escape. No one would leave this rig unscathed. The machine had already begun its work, and now it was too late for anyone to turn back. The only question that remained was what role they would all play in its unfolding catastrophe. Would they be consumed like Sarah? Or would they be forced to become part of the nightmare itself? The machine's hum intensified, its presence suffocating, and Wallace knew that the unraveling had only just begun. Wallace stood in the dimly lit room, staring at the machine. His body ached from the forceful jolt it had given him, the residual electricity still dancing beneath his skin. His mind raced, trying to process the horror of what had just occurred. It was no longer just about survival. It was about understanding. The machine had marked him, chosen him. And for what purpose? He was no longer just an observer of this monstrous entity. He was part of it. And with that, the weight of responsibility crushed down upon him. As the hum of the machine reverberated in his ears, Wallace tried to make sense of what he had learned. The words, or rather, the whispers, that had flooded his mind earlier were not random. They were deliberate, calculated. The machine had been waiting for someone who could understand it, someone who could interpret its messages. And now that it had him, it seemed as if it would not let go. The question lingered. What was the machine really? At first, it had seemed like a mere tool, a high-tech device built for a singular purpose, extracting oil. But now, Wallace understood that it was much more than that. It was a conduit, a bridge between worlds, an ancient mechanism designed to tap into forces far beyond human comprehension. It was not just the Earth's oil that it sought, but something much deeper, something primal and old, something that defied the laws of nature. The deeper Wallace delved into the machine's purpose, the more he realized that it was not meant to be understood by mere mortals. It was a key to unlocking untold power, and the price of that knowledge was steep. He thought of the crew, those who had disappeared without a trace. They had been the first to fall victim to the machine's insatiable hunger. Each one, likely unknowingly, had been part of the process. Some had been sacrificed, others absorbed into the machine's very fabric, their minds and souls now part of the dark energy it controlled. Wallace had been too late to save them, too late to stop this disaster from unfolding. The rig had never been a place of work. It had always been a place of ritual, a place where the boundaries between the physical and metaphysical were blurred. What made the situation worse was that Wallace wasn't alone in his understanding. Sarah had been the first to see the truth, to feel the pull of the machine, and she had been drawn into its grasp long before Wallace had come to terms with his own fate. Her disappearance wasn't an accident. It was part of the machine's plan. It was as if she had known, deep down, that she would be the first to witness the machine's true power, and she had embraced it. But what had it done to her? Was she still alive, or had she become a part of the dark force the machine had unleashed? A sickening realization washed over Wallace as he pieced together the fragments of his understanding. The machine was not just alive, it was ancient, older than any civilization, and it had been waiting for the right moment to awaken. And now, with the knowledge it had imparted upon him, Wallace realized the cost of that awakening. It wasn't just the crew members who had been sacrificed, it was the fabric of reality itself. The rig, now more of a nexus than a structure, was a point of convergence, where the boundaries between worlds were collapsing. What they had unleashed could not be undone. The question now was whether it could be controlled. The whispers had not stopped since the moment Wallace had touched the machine. They had become more coherent, more insistent, urging him to take action. The machine wanted him to make a choice, to decide how he would proceed. But what was there left to do? The rig was sinking into madness, and no matter how hard Wallace tried to fight it, the machine's influence was growing stronger. Its energy was seeping into every corner of the rig, warping everything it touched. The lights flickered, the air grew thick with an unsettling chill, and the very ground beneath him seemed to shift, as if the rig itself was alive, breathing. His thoughts drifted back to the crew, those who remained, those who hadn't yet been absorbed into the machine's grip. Would they be able to resist the pull of the machine, or were they already too far gone? Wallace couldn't be sure. The longer they stayed, the more they were exposed to the machine's power. He could already see the signs in their eyes, vacant stares, unnatural calm, as if they, too, were hearing the whispers that had driven him to madness. They were no longer themselves. They were becoming extensions of the machine, just as he had. The weight of his choices pressed down on him. He had made a critical error in coming to this rig, but now that he understood the depth of the machine's influence, there was no turning back. He was trapped, just as the others were. The machine's grip on him was tightening, and there was only one way to break free. But what would it cost? Wallace couldn't escape without confronting the machine. He couldn't survive without dismantling its influence, even if it meant sacrificing everything, his mind, his body, his very soul. But the most terrifying thought of all was this. Could he truly dismantle the machine? Or was he destined to become like the others? Just another pawn in a game that spanned beyond time, beyond space, beyond the limits of human comprehension? The whispers grew louder, filling his ears, urging him onward. Wallace closed his eyes, blocking out the noise, and with a deep breath, he steeled himself. Whatever the price was, he had no choice but to pay it. The rig, the machine, and everything it represented had to be stopped before it consumed them all. But as he took the first step toward that inevitable confrontation, Wallace couldn't help but wonder. Was he too far gone already to make a difference? Or had he just become the final piece in the machine's twisted puzzle? The darkness had already begun to claim the rig. The question was no longer about whether they could survive. It was whether they could ever escape the nightmare they had awakened. The cold wind howled outside the confines of the rig, but within, there was an eerie stillness. Wallace could hear the faint hum of the machine growing louder, as if it were aware of his thoughts, his every hesitation. The whispers had reached a fever pitch, urging him to act, to make the final decision. But what could he possibly do now? The truth was undeniable. He was at the mercy of something much greater than himself, something that had far exceeded his understanding. His first instinct had been to try and dismantle the machine, to destroy it and stop whatever had been set in motion. But as he ventured deeper into the heart of the rig, he quickly realized that the task was not that simple. It wasn't just a machine in the traditional sense. It was part of the very structure of the rig itself, its mechanisms woven into the metal and the very ground beneath. The machine and the rig were one, inseparable, intertwined in a way that seemed to defy all logic and reason. There was no escaping it. The rig had transformed into a living, breathing entity, its energy pulsating through every metal beam, every joint, every inch of space. It was as if it had fused with the world around it, becoming a conduit to something far darker, more ancient. The crew members who had survived until now, those who hadn't been absorbed by the machine, were now little more than hollow shells, walking zombies with glazed eyes. They were completely subsumed by the machine's power. They didn't even acknowledge Wallace as he passed by, their movements slow and deliberate, as if following an invisible command. Wallace had made the decision long ago to fight back, to resist the pull of the machine, no matter the cost. But now, as he stood alone in the center of the rig, he was struck by the overwhelming realization that perhaps resistance was futile. The machine wasn't just an invader, it was the natural order here. It had been waiting for centuries, buried beneath the ocean, hidden from the world until the right moment. And now, that moment had arrived. It had chosen this place, this rig, to awaken and unleash its power upon the world. He tried to think of a way to reverse the process, but the more he thought about it, the more it seemed like the machine had anticipated every move. It had known someone would come, someone would try to stop it, and it had already accounted for that. The machine was as much a part of him now as it was a part of the rig. Each attempt to resist only seemed to strengthen its hold on him, the whispers growing louder, more insistent, urging him to surrender. And for a brief, terrifying moment, Wallace wondered if perhaps surrender was the only choice left. But as he stood there, the weight of his choices pressing on him, he remembered Sarah. Sarah had known the truth long before he had understood the machine's power and its pull. She had been the first to see it, the first to be consumed by it. She hadn't been destroyed, she had been transformed. Maybe she hadn't been a victim at all. Maybe she had embraced the machine's call, willingly becoming a part of something greater than herself. Wallace had thought she was lost, but now, as the weight of her choices began to sink in, he realized that she had been the key all along. The rig was not just a physical structure. It was a gateway, a point of convergence between worlds. The machine was not just seeking to extract resources. It was seeking to open a portal, a passage through which something far darker could enter. Wallace's survival, the survival of the rig, and the survival of the world beyond were all tied to this singular truth. The machine was a harbinger of something ancient and malevolent, something that had been waiting for the right moment to return. And now, that moment had come. For the first time in days, Wallace felt something like clarity. The rig was a trap, yes, but it was also a prison that had held the machine and its power for centuries. And he, like Sarah, was caught in its grasp. But unlike Sarah, Wallace wasn't ready to surrender. He would not become just another pawn in this game, another cog in the machine's twisted design. There had to be a way out. There had to be a way to stop it before it was too late. The answer came to him in a flash, a realization so simple, so horrifying, that it made his stomach churn. The machine had always known it needed a conduit, someone to carry its essence, to bridge the gap between this world and the one it sought to open. Sarah had been that conduit. She had been the first to fall under its influence, the first to be transformed into a vessel for the machine's dark power. And now, Wallace was the only one left. He was the only one who could stop it. But to do so, he would have to make the ultimate sacrifice. The thought terrified him. To stop the machine, he would have to sever its connection to the rig. Sever the connection that had been created when it first began to pulse with energy. But in doing so, he would likely lose everything, his mind, his body, his very essence. There would be no turning back. The whispers, the pull of the machine, would consume him, just as they had consumed the others. And yet, as he stood there, in the heart of the rig, Wallace realized that there was no other choice. He couldn't allow the machine to consume him, to consume the world. He had come this far, had seen the truth of what lay beyond the rig's walls. He couldn't let it all be for nothing. With a deep breath, Wallace stepped forward, his body trembling, his mind racing. He would make the final choice. He would confront the machine, face its power head-on, and destroy it. The cost would be high, but if there was any hope left for the world, for the crew, for himself, it had to be done. The whispers grew silent as he reached the heart of the machine, its energy crackling around him. Wallace closed his eyes, ready to face whatever came next. The silence that followed Wallace's final decision was suffocating. The rig seemed to hold its breath, as if the very structure of the place was aware of the monumental choice he had just made. The whispers, once deafening and relentless, had ceased entirely. For a fleeting moment, Wallace thought he might have succeeded, that perhaps by confronting the machine, he had severed its hold on the rig, its energy, and all that it represented. But as he stood in the heart of the machine's pulsating core, a chilling realization began to creep over him. The silence was not a victory, it was the calm before the storm. The rig was not merely a structure of metal and machinery, as he had thought. It was alive in ways he could not comprehend. The deeper he ventured into its innermost workings, the more it became clear that this was not just a place where the machine had chosen to awaken. It was a place of convergence. The rig was built upon an ancient network, a series of hidden veins stretching far below the ocean's surface, reaching into the very bedrock of the earth. It was as if the rig itself had been constructed to be the vessel for the machine, and now, in the final moments, it was preparing to birth something far more horrific. Wallace's hand trembled as he reached for the control panel, the cold metal of the console sending an electric jolt through his fingertips. The machine had not given up. It had not relented. Its power was still there, deep within the rig's veins, pulsing with a rhythmic insistence, as though the heartbeat of the world itself was being drawn into the depths. He tried to activate the emergency shutdown sequence, but the panel flickered and died, the lights dimming as the hum of the machine grew louder, more insistent. The realization struck him with brutal clarity. The machine had anticipated his every move. There was no shutting it down. There was no escaping it. The machine had not merely been trying to open a portal. It had been laying the groundwork for something far more insidious. The ritual that had begun with Sarah's transformation, the subtle shifts in the crew, the eerie silence in the air, everything had been a part of a much larger design. The machine was not simply a tool to be destroyed. It was a living, breathing entity that required a sacrifice. And now, Wallace understood the true cost of what he had to do. The whispers, though silent for a time, returned with a vengeance, more insistent than ever. They came not from the machine, but from within him, his own mind, his own body, his very soul. They were no longer the voices of the crew or the rig. They were his own thoughts, twisted and distorted by the machine's influence. It was as if the very nature of the machine had seeped into his being, infecting him in ways he could not control. "You cannot stop it," the voice in his mind whispered, as clear as day. "You are part of it now. You always have been." Wallace's knees buckled beneath him, the weight of the truth crashing over him like a tidal wave. His attempts to resist had only fed the machine, had only served to strengthen its hold on him. The machine wasn't a foreign entity, it was him. It was in his blood, in his bones, in the very core of his existence. The realization was more terrifying than anything he had encountered so far. There was no fight left to win. The battle had been lost before it had even begun. In that moment, Wallace understood that the only way to end this, to truly stop the machine, was not through destruction, but through acceptance. He had to become the conduit, the vessel, the final link in the chain that would bind the machine to the world it sought to dominate. But in doing so, he would have to sacrifice everything: his identity, his mind, his humanity. The rig shook violently, the ground trembling beneath his feet as the machine's power surged to its peak. The walls groaned, the metal creaking as if in agony. And for the first time, Wallace felt the full weight of the machine's hunger. It was not merely drawing energy from the earth. It was feeding on the very essence of life itself. It sought to consume the world, to remake it in its image. And Wallace was its final key. He staggered to his feet, his vision blurred as the rig around him seemed to twist and warp. The lights flickered and died, plunging the rig into total darkness. The hum of the machine grew deafening, vibrating through his very bones, and Wallace knew that time was running out. If he didn't act now, if he didn't make the ultimate choice, the world as he knew it would cease to exist. There was no escaping it. The moment of truth had arrived. Wallace closed his eyes, his mind racing through the memories of everything he had learned. The crew, the rig, the machine, it was all connected. It had always been connected. The only way to stop it now was to merge with it, to allow the machine to take him completely, to become one with it. And in doing so, he would become the final barrier that would prevent the machine from breaking through to the world beyond. But there was no escaping the inevitable. Wallace knew that in order to stop the machine, he had to sacrifice his very soul. The machine was not just a force of nature. It was a force of entropy, a destroyer of worlds. And in that moment, as he felt the machine's power surge through him, Wallace understood that his salvation was not in fighting it, but in surrendering to it. His mind went blank as he stepped forward, ready to face the unknown, ready to give everything he had to ensure that the world would survive. The price of salvation was steep, but Wallace was prepared to pay it, for he knew that the only way to prevent the horrors of the machine from consuming everything was to allow it to consume him first. And so, with his final breath, Wallace let go. The machine embraced him, and in that moment, the rig's violent shaking ceased. The whispers fell silent, and the world waited, uncertain of what would come next. The aftermath of Wallace's final act was not what anyone had expected. For days, there had been no word from the oil rig. The radio silence was deafening. The crew, still locked in a state of perpetual tension and fear, awaited any signal, any sign that their world, no, their universe, had not been irrevocably altered. They had been left to wonder if Wallace's decision had truly sealed their fate, or if there was some hope that they could still turn back, salvage what remained, and make sense of the unspeakable events that had unfolded. On the surface, everything appeared to be normal. The sea had returned to its endless rhythm, the waves lapping against the rig's foundations as they always had. The wind still carried the briny tang of salt, and the sun continued its climb across the horizon, indifferent to the horror unfolding beneath. But as the crew waited for a signal, for some indication that the machine had been subdued, they began to sense an ominous stillness. The rig no longer hummed with the same mechanical energy it once had. The lights flickered sporadically. The air itself seemed thicker, heavier, charged with an energy that couldn't be explained. It was not until the search teams arrived that the true scale of what had occurred began to sink in. When they finally docked at the rig and boarded the platform, the sight that greeted them was one of total desolation. The crew, once a vibrant and chaotic group of men and women, was gone. There was no sign of struggle, no indication of a fight or panic. It was as though they had simply vanished, leaving behind only the eerie emptiness of their quarters and workstations. The machine, its heart now silenced, stood at the center of the rig, dormant and lifeless, but its presence still hung in the air, an invisible weight that pressed down on every inch of the platform. The search teams moved cautiously, exploring every inch of the rig, but they found no answers. They discovered Wallace's final message, an encrypted recording delivered just hours before he had made the ultimate decision. In it, his voice was raspy, worn, as though he had aged years in the span of minutes. He spoke of the machine, of the choices he had made, and the price he had paid. But there was no explanation of what had happened afterward, no clue as to the consequences of his actions. The recording ended abruptly, leaving the question of what had truly transpired at the heart of the rig unanswered. For days, the world watched in stunned silence. News outlets speculated wildly, but no one could offer a definitive explanation. The machine, the oil rig, the disappearances, they were all part of a larger, more incomprehensible mystery. But what most failed to understand was that the rig, once a symbol of human innovation and industry, had become something else entirely. It had transformed into a monument to mankind's attempt to control forces far beyond their understanding, forces that were not meant to be harnessed or contained. As the weeks passed, rumors began to swirl. People spoke of sightings of strange occurrences near the site of the rig. Some claimed to have seen figures, human figures, moving along the water's edge or standing on the horizon at dusk, their forms obscured by fog or distance. Others whispered that the rig had not been destroyed, but rather had become a part of something else. They said it had become a conduit, a threshold, a doorway to something far beyond what humanity could comprehend. Scientists were brought in, but they, too, were baffled by the results of their investigations. The materials from the rig, metal, wires, and the remnants of the machine, had undergone an inexplicable transformation. Some elements appeared to have been fused with substances not found on Earth, while others seemed to have vanished entirely, as though they had been absorbed into the very fabric of reality. The records, too, were unreliable. Any digital record or video feed from the rig had been corrupted beyond recognition, leaving behind only fragmented pieces of data, as if the machine itself had wiped its own existence from the grid. The most unsettling development came when the authorities tried to reach out to the families of the missing crew members. Every attempt to contact them was met with silence. And then, gradually, a chilling pattern emerged. The families of the missing crew members began to report strange occurrences of their own. Some claimed to hear voices, whispers of loved ones who had perished on the rig. Others reported dreams of their family members, alive and well, but distant, as if trapped in a world that they could not reach. There were no answers to be found, no closure. The world continued, oblivious to the true horror that had unfolded at sea. But for those who had lived through it, the memories lingered like a ghost that refused to let go. The rig, though abandoned, still called to them. And though the machine had been silenced, its legacy endured. Wallace had chosen to confront the machine, to face the unknown, and to make the ultimate sacrifice. But in doing so, he had not stopped the machine. He had become a part of it, one of the countless souls the machine had claimed over the course of its long existence. And now, with the world moving on, it was as though the rig had never been. The truth of what had happened would never be known to the masses. It was a story buried deep within the rig's dark heart, a story that only the few who had survived, or those who had paid the price, would ever truly understand. As for the world outside, the machine's influence was far from over. The threads that had been woven into the fabric of reality were still there, faint but persistent. And for those who dared to ask the right questions, the answers would always be out of reach, hidden beneath layers of silence, mystery, and the unrelenting power of the unknown. The end of one story was merely the beginning of another.